right. So hi everybody. I'm Ryan Bednar. As Tim mentioned, I do some guiding, fishing guide for Asheville Fly Fishing Company. I do muskie trips and some smallmouth trips, but I'm definitely a muskie addict at heart and could talk about it all day. So I'm going to try to keep it pretty concise, but you know, at any time, feel free to ask questions, and we'll do the same thing. We'll go through some questions at the end too. So, so first thing, let's just go right into, you know, why I fly fish for muskies. And this isn't necessarily why you guys should fly fish for muskies, but I'm just going to explain my thinking on it. The first thing I'll say is if you're really wanting to just catch muskies, there's probably easier ways to do it. But I enjoy it because it is challenging, both mentally and physically. And at least from my perspective, you know, the challenge of muskie fishing is really what it's all about anyway. Some muskie guys may not admit it, but I think we all like that challenge. And if you're into that, you know, the fly fishing kind of adds a little bit to that in some ways. So that's a big part of it for me. Also, it is effective. It's a different technique. It's got kind of its pros and cons, but there's certain times of the year, especially like this time of year, when, you know, fish are maybe a little more lethargic and a little more selective, where I think a fly can do some things that your conventional lures may not be able to do. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit as well. But another reason is you know, I really kind of consider muskie fishing and really any type of fishing as a craft. It's something that, you know, at least in muskie fishing and how I approach it, it's kind of a limitless outlet for creativity. You know, Tim's the same way with the gear world, and you know, we're always thinking about new ways to get better at our craft. And it's, you know, the fly fishing element, especially with, you know, being able to tie your own flies, you know, all the different variables. You know, there's just tons of ways you can be creative and really kind of improve your success at it. And kind of more on that line, like it's a deeper dive into the rabbit hole that is muskie fishing, higher highs and lower lows. So if you've done a lot of muskie fishing, or just even a little bit, you'll know it's frustrating. Fly fishing will just add to that frustration. And then when you have that victory of catching the fish, it just feels that much better. You know, again, that's just me, so it may be different for you. But, you know, it's always really important at the end of the day to remember this is all about fun. So, you know, if you're having fun, you're doing something right. If you're not, then, you know, don't do it. So that's that part. All right, so we'll just kind of jump right into some basics here. You'll see there's some kind of parallels with the conventional gear world, like some of the things that Tim talked about are going to be kind of similar to, you know, with the fly fishing world, but there's going to be some differences as well. When you're choosing a fly rod, you know, we're typically talking about 10 to 12 weight fly rods. I put a little plus in there because there's some newer rods that are kind of marketed and designed specifically for muskie fishing that, you know, are kind of creeping into the, you know, 14, even 15 weight, but they'll still be kind of targeted for muskie fishing, and it may even still be listed as like a 12 weight fly rod. So just keep that in mind. It is big rods, and the big rods are there for fighting fish to some degree, but really a lot of it is for throwing larger flies, which we'll talk about that too. Also, at least I know when I first got into muskie fishing, everybody was talking about just finding the biggest, stiffest rod you could find. Just thinking, you know, bigger rod, better rod. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, like most of the rods made today are going to be more of a medium to medium fast action rod. Reason being is that, you know, most of the fly lines that we're throwing are going to be a sinking line, and the cadence of the cast is going to be easier on you, and also just a more pleasant cast if you use a slightly slower action rod. So like medium to medium fast rods are what most of the, you know, muskie specific rods are kind of designed to be these days. So, you know, you may, you know, a saltwater specific style of fly rod can work and absolutely does work. But, you know, going with that idea of the fish to 10,000 cast, if you throw a saltwater rod with a big fly for 10,000 cast, your arm's going to feel it. So medium to medium fast action rods will make that a little bit more enjoyable. Also, you know, now we have quite a few manufacturers now making muskie specific rods, because they do have a little bit of a different set of requirements, and some of the features of them are a little more specific to the type of fishing we're doing. One of those things is going to be an extended cork and grip on the rod. Probably the two main reasons for those would be, you know, going back to just the number of casts you're going to be doing throughout the day. You know, it does wear on your arm, your elbow, your shoulder. By having an extended grip on the rod, you're able to kind of shift the grip of the rod as you go throughout the day. Like, you know, as I get a little tired, maybe I choke up a little bit more on the rod. Just being able to kind of vary your grip is pretty huge if you're, you know, if you're going 8, 10 plus hours a day. Also, the most of the musky fly rods will have an extended butt below the reel seat. Part of that, and really the main reason for that, is going to be for just helping you out with the figure eight, kind of similar to your bait caster rods. It's just going to make it so where you get a little bit more leverage. It's going to make those figure eights easier, a little less strain on your shoulder. Definitely really helpful things. And you know, kind of another thing that's starting to kind of pop up with these new types of rods is two-handed fly rods. And this is all, you'll kind of see a theme throughout this presentation too, where you know, fly fishing for muskie is a strain on your body. You're definitely putting a lot of strain on joints just throughout the course of the day. So these two-handed fly rods, they're fairly new, but they're kind of similar to sort of the spay rods that guys will use out west for steelhead, that sort of thing. Not quite as long, but with these bigger two-handed rods, you're able to kind of use the leverage of your left hand or your non-dominant hand to kind of help with that cast. I've just in the last year started kind of experimenting with those a lot, and they definitely make the grind of casting all day a lot easier on your body. So something to consider if you're starting and looking at rods. Just something you should know about, so I thought I'd mention that. There's definitely a lot of different manufacturers making fly rods for muskies, but I listed a few here that I use personally. There's other ones out there that are great, but Temple Fork Outfitters, Wolf Rod Company, and Chippewa River Custom Rods, they all make a specific muskie style rod, and they're all really good quality. They know what the target species is about, and that means a lot. So you know, like I said before, you can go with a saltwater rod, and that'll work just fine, especially if you're just getting started in it. But if you're really going to dedicate some time to it, you know, finding something that's more, you know, specifically made for muskies will really help you out. All right, so choosing a fly reel is a really easy decision. It doesn't really matter what it is. You don't, you know, unlike the conventional baitcaster reels, that sort of thing, you don't need a high-end or expensive reel. With fly fishing, really the only thing the reel does is just hold the line and keep it organized for you. You know, when you're never going to really fight a fish on the reel, you don't need a heavy drag, all of that. You know, when you're fighting a fish 9 times out of 10, maybe even 19 times out of 20, whatever, you're fighting that fish manually with your offhand, just connected, you know, to the fish with just the line in your hand, you're pulling tight. So that reel is just organizing your line and keeping it, you know, out from underneath your feet, basically. And something I've started doing, I know other guys do it as well, is, you know, let's say you're using a 12 weight rod. On my 12 weight rods, I use a reel designed for a 9 or a 10 weight rod. It's just going to save a little bit of weight. Saves you a tiny bit of money, just, you know, downsizing as well. But you know, you don't need, you know, I guess the size of the reel is typically determined by, like, you know, the manufacturers expect that you're going to put a certain amount of backing on the fly reel. You know, especially if you're going for tarpon or something like that, you might need a couple hundred yards of backing. If you see your backing on a fly reel, you did something wrong, and you're probably stuck to a tree as you're dragging down the river or something. So something's going on if you see your backing. So, you know, I do put a little bit of backing on there, but for the most part, you know, as long as your line fits on that reel, it's fine. It's just gonna, you know, even if you save yourself a few ounces of weight, multiply that by however many hundreds or thousand casts that you do throughout the day, it's going to take a little bit of wear and tear off you. So, and, you know, rather than purchasing an expensive reel, if you got the money to spend, I'd consider purchasing an extra spool. And on that spool, you can put different types of fly line. So maybe you carry a backup fly line if something happens throughout the day, or you might want to put a different type of fly line with a different sink rate on it. I usually carry you know, a faster sinking line and then a slower sinking line, just depending on conditions. So that's a nice little addition as well. So choosing fly lines, you know, probably for whatever the reel is not important, I guess. Whatever it lacks in importance, probably the fly line makes up for it. It's probably right up there with the rod as the #1 most important piece of equipment that you have in that system, basically. And your fly line is actually what determines your depth of your fly. So you know, it really is, it's where you want to spend the money. You want a good quality fly line. And unfortunately, it's also one of the more kind of unnecessarily complicated parts when you're trying to kind of piece a fly rod and reel and line together. It's probably the place most people get confused. So I'm going to try to kind of just make it real simple for everybody. Basically, the #1 thing you want to remember is matching the fly line weight to your rod. So if you go with a 10 weight rod, you want to make sure to get a 10 weight line. If you get a 12 weight rod, you want to get a 12 weight line. That seems pretty straightforward, and for the most part that is, but for whatever reason, fly line manufacturers like to kind of fudge the numbers a little bit. So if, for example, some companies on a 10 weight line, they may actually overweight it by one size, so it's actually more like an 11 weight, which is fine, and it's probably not going to make a big difference in your casting. It's not going to ruin your day or make it to where you can't fish or anything like that. But I think a better thing to look at, and I think what most of the fly line manufacturers are starting to do now, is they're starting to list not only the line weight, but the grain weight more specifically. The grain weight kind of gives you a more consistent number from the different line weights. For example, like the grain weight of and this is just one example of a fly line that I use. It's been a really good kind of middle of the road, good all-purpose line. And you'll see over here on the right, it's saying that a 400 grain line is suited to a 9 to 10 weight. 450 grain line is suited to a 10 to 11. 500 grain line is an 11 to 12 weight. So personally, when I'm choosing my fly lines for my rod, first thing I want to do is I want to look up, you know, what the rod manufacturers suggest as far as for a specific, for a given rod. They'll say, you know, maybe for a 12 weight rod, they'll say go with a 450 to 500 grain line. And that's going to give me a more accurate representation than just going by this kind of arbitrary 10, 11, 12 weight matchup, if that makes sense. And, you know, there is a little bit of overlap. Like, you know, like I said, you can downsize and upsize a line, and it's not gonna ruin things. But the more you do this, the more you're gonna find that you have a certain casting stroke, and you may find, like for me personally, I find that on my 12 weight rods, I tend to like a slightly lighter line. So I tend to go with a 450 grain line on a 12 weight. So just by paying attention to the grain weights of things, you're going to have more consistency from one type of line to the next, because all manufacturers may not stick with this matchup of grain weight to the rod weight, if that makes sense. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but lesson learned there is just pay attention to the grain weights of both your rod and your line. Probably the next most important thing is going to be the sink rate of the line. And that's really, from a fishing standpoint, that's probably the number one thing. We do a little bit of topwater fly fishing, but the vast majority of it's all going to be subsurface. So, and then also thinking about like the flies that we're throwing, they're all relatively unweighted. Most of those flies are going to be built from deer hair, feathers, little synthetic fibers. Everything's really light. So there's no real built-in weight into the flies for the most part. So you're relying upon your fly line to get it to the depth that you're wanting to fish. So paying attention to what your sink rate of your fly line is critical. Again, this particular Scientific Anglers Sonar Muskie is just one that I found that's, it's designed for muskie. It's designed to, turn over big flies. It's got a heavier core. There's a lot of good fly lines that do the same thing, but this particular line has a good kind of middle of the road sink rate. And sometimes you have to dig a little bit to find out what that sink rate is. The sink rate's measured in inches per second. So for every second that fly line's sitting in the water, it's sinking that many inches every second. So a good middle of the road, and the same thing with this particular line, is that this is a sink 5. Oops. So it's a sink 5, which just means that it sinks 5 inches for every second it's in the water. I also use a sink 9 sometimes, especially this time of year when I want to get down a little deeper, a little faster. And then there's certain times, like if the river's real low and clear in the summer, and I need to let that fly or my presentation move a little slower, I may not want it sinking down to the bottom quite as quickly. So I may go to like a sink 2 or even an intermediate line. And that kind of, to go into like intermediate and floating lines, like we don't use them very often, or at least I don't personally, but they do have their place. The best way to think of a intermediate line is, the intermediate line for the most part just breaks the surface tension of the water. So it's not floating. It's just going to sink kind of a little below the surface. It might sink an inch a second, something like that. But the advantage to that over a floating line, if you're fishing a subsurface fly, but you just want it fishing shallow, if you've got a floating line, that line's hanging out on the surface of the water. So every time you're stripping your fly back, it's actually pulling it back up to the surface of the water. So the intermediate line will just basically kind of break that surface tension and just keep it at a nice shallow depth, but keep it from porpoising out of the water every strip. And then sometimes we do use topwater flies, and often you can actually, most of those topwater flies are so buoyant that you can kind of get away with an intermediate line. So if you're wanting a more versatile line, I would absolutely have your faster sinking line, whatever that is. But if you want a secondary line, I might suggest an intermediate line. Floating line is really, I don't really use them all that often unless I'm just strictly fishing topwater. So yeah, mostly sinking lines there. If I was going to get 2, I'd get probably like a 5 inch per second, and maybe like a 3 inch per second line, something like that. Especially for the French broad. If you're fishing lakes and faster, deeper waters, then maybe I might go to the little bit faster sinking lines. All right. Leader construction, this is kind of a whole topic that probably every fly guy will have their own kind of formula for their best leaders. I think the one thing most fly guys will agree upon is to use some sort of wire leader. There's not necessarily anything wrong with using fluorocarbon, but like I used fluorocarbon without any bite off problems for a long time. I used 80-pound fluorocarbon for the longest time. But in the back of my mind, I always knew that, it could happen at any point. Fluorocarbon is not bite proof, I guess. So,
hey, Ryan?
Yes.
I think we had a question from Dino.
Okay.
Dino, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to ask him, hey, Ryan, you strictly control the depth of your flies with line, huh? No kind of weight at all, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's not always the case, but that's like 99% of the case. Like I do tie a few kind of jig style flies, but they're really more of like a kind of a niche thing. Like, I tend to use like a jig style fly, like if I'm actually like sight fishing to a specific fish where I want to kind of pinpoint a presentation. But for the most part, I try to fish, or most of the flies that I tie are going to be more like neutrally buoyant. So really they just go wherever the fly line goes. They're just kind of following the bus, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Any other questions on fly lines? And we can come back to that too if anybody has any other questions. All right. So sticking with the leaders, just my preference, I used to use the fluorocarbon, but now I'm just knowing in the back of my mind, if, in case I ever hook that trophy fish, I just want that peace of mind to know that I've got a wire leader there. So I would suggest if you don't have a personal preference in that, I would stick with a wire leader. The downside of, in my opinion too, of a fluorocarbon leader, if you start going so thick that, if you're in that 80 to 100 pound or plus range of fluorocarbon, you've got a real stiff piece of fluorocarbon, and you're actually like really kind of muting the action you're going to get from your fly. So I've just found my flies move better if I've got a wire leader. The wire I use is really easy to find. I mostly use that American fishing wire, but also Cortland makes them, Rio, Scientific Anglers, tons of stuff out there. But basically, it's just a nylon coated. I think it's a 7x7 strand braided steel. So you can tie. They're easy to tie knots with them, but I will say, and this could open up a whole can of worms too on what knots to use. I won't really talk about the knots too much, but whatever knot you use, go on YouTube, learn some knots. Whatever knots you decide to use, practice them religiously. Don't try to do that on the water. I actually usually have 5-6 pre-tied leaders that I keep in the boat just so I don't have to deal with it when my hands are cold or I've got a fish. If I got bit off or I don't want to get bit off, but if I broke a leader based on like got a fly caught in the tree or something like that, and I see my leader's frayed, last thing I want to do is have to tie up a new leader. And it's just doing it on the water is the best opportunity to tie a bad knot. So the best knot to use is the knot that you tie the best. And it's preferred that the best knot that you're going to tie is one that you've practiced. And then kind of the next most important thing of that is to test your knot. So when I tie my leaders at home, I basically, I've got a knot from where I'm connecting the fly line to my monofilament, the leader portion. And then I have a knot that connects that monofilament portion to my wire bite material. And then I also have a knot that attaches to the stay lock clip that I use. Some people tie it straight to the fly, and that's fine too. But, just right there, that's 3 different knots. And I am 100% confident in every single one of those knots that I tie. They may be different from somebody else's knot, but that's the thing you want to, you want to tie these. I think you want to tie these at home, test them out, try to break them. If you can break them, I know it kind of sucks when you spend all this time tying knots and you break it, but you broke it at a good time and not at a bad time. Again, the worst thing that can happen is, you kind of catch that fish of a lifetime. And even if it doesn't break off, if you're fighting that fish the whole time and doubting that knot that you tied, it's not a good feeling. So practice those knots religiously. If you do use stay lock snaps, everybody's got their preference on what type of snap, or if they want to tie directly to the fly, all that's fine. But if you use any type of snap, it's very important to change those out regularly. They're actually, when you pull them out of the packages, they're not easy to open and close. They're kind of a pain in the butt. But after you use them, you change 10 or 20 flies, they get easier to open. If they start getting easy to open, that's the time to switch them out and throw them away. I've never had a problem with them, but I know guys that have, and that's been the most important thing. They're relatively cheap, so just you're kind of the theme of all this is don't have your leader or your knots or your connectors be the weak link in your system. You got enough to worry about just trying to catch these fish. You don't want to have a failure on a cheap piece of equipment. Also, too, just a couple quick tips. When you are using these heavier, gauge monofilaments and fluorocarbon and wire, they all have special knots. And when you're watching videos or looking at tutorials online, sometimes it looks like they just cinch. They're so pretty in the videos and everything like that, and then when you do them, and they just don't look right when you're tying them, especially if it's the first few times you tied them. There's a trick to all of them. Sometimes you got to cinch them down in steps, and like pulling on a tag in one time, pulling on the standing line another time. So don't get frustrated with it. Once you get good with your knots, and you have a knot that you like, and when you test it, you can't break it, there's really no reason to switch to a different knot. Just whatever knot you choose. Again, I can't stress it enough. Practice and then test them all the time. And if anybody's curious on just what knots I want to use, so that you can, do your own research and look online on how to tie them. For the fly line to the leader, I use a perfection loop. So it's just a loop to loop knot, basically the same type of knot that you'd use on a, probably on trout leaders and bass leaders. Pretty simple. For the monofilament leader, like your fluorocarbon or your monofilament, to the connection to the wire bite guard, I use a Slim Beauty knot. Nothing real fancy there either. You can find videos online. And then for the wire to the snap or to the fly, I use a figure 8 knot. Really easy fly, a really easy knot, but the critical part on all of them is to tie them correctly in practice. So I won't harp on the knots anymore. Fly patterns. So
Ryan, 1 second before you move on. Looks like we got a question from Chris Brady, and he's saying Scientific Anglers 357 sink line. Is that too much sink for the French Broad?
No, not at all. In fact, I use that one quite a bit too. It's a really good line. I think, yeah, so it's 357. That just means that the head of the line is sinking at 7 inches per second. It's triple density sink, so it's 7 at the tip, and then I think the next section back is going to be 5 inches per second, and then the next one's 3. So it's not a huge difference. I tend to like that line a little bit more at higher flows, and also I like it better like when it's not super cold. Mostly just because that SA Muskie line, the thing I like about it is that it has a little bit thicker running line in it, so when your hands are cold and you're stripping a lot, that 357 line, in my opinion, it's kind of thin and it shoots so fast that I sometimes it slips through my fingers, or I just don't grab it correctly when I'm stripping. So I just have like, I try to go for a big strip and then don't get anything. So it's a great line. I've got no qualms with it whatsoever. I use it all, use it quite a bit, but for just versatility, I like that SA Muskie a little better.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. So fly patterns. I'm going to keep this one pretty short because it's kind of unlike the gear world where you got to have tons of different types of lures, or you don't have to, but there's a whole world of lures out there. The big difference, I think, with fly and gear and lures is that the fly has some built-in movement to it, but the majority of the movement is what you put into it. And I guess that's true with lures as well. But you can make I could pick one fly out of this photo and make it fish like a glide bait, a crankbait, a soft plastic bait. I kind of make the fly do what I want it to do. That being said, there's definitely some flies that do better than others. There's some that I have confidence more than others, but it's probably, if I know when I'm guiding, I may have a confidence in just one of these flies. But if I have confidence when I hand that to that customer and he fishes it, he's going to have that confidence too. And it's really all about, that's going to be a kind of an underlying theme of all this, is just have confidence in what you're throwing. If you bass fish or whatever, and you've got favorite colors, that's a good place to start with your flies. And when I say flies, I know this is probably pretty obvious, but we're not talking about imitating insects. We're talking about imitating bait fish. And, these are very rough imitations of bait fish. So, it's kind of more of an impressionistic rather than imitation. The colors are all over the place. I'd say we're probably imitating size of a bait fish, which, if you know about our local bait fish, we're looking at, anything from probably 6 inches all the way up to 20 plus inches. So lots of options there. No particular color better than the other than just what you have personal confidence in. And personally, I like bright colors just because, if I'm grinding and casting for, 8 hours or so, just having a color that I can see in the water and I can see how my fly is dancing back and forth, like that keeps me more engaged. And that's going to make it to where I've got more success. If I'm engaged, I'm going to do much better than if I'm just casting and retrieving, going through the motion. So when I pick a fly, I'm picking a fly that I'm excited to throw, and that's about how I choose my flies. And obviously the size of the fly and like what you're comfortable casting all day is a huge part of that. One thing I will say about flies, especially if you tie your own, is resist the urge to just put more and more stuff on there. Less material is better. Going back to the idea of a neutral fly and letting the fly line get it to depth. If you've got too much material on there, it's like a wet sock in the water. So it's not gonna dance and shimmy and move side to side. So if you have less material and you're still able to get that good profile, like that's the sign of a good fly. You'll see also too in some of these flies, I actually use quite a bit of treble hooks in my flies, and that's more of a something I do on the larger flies. Because kind of like with some of the big rubber baits that conventional tackle guys are using, some of these flies are, I don't know if you guys can see, but this is one fly here. It's probably 17 inches or so, and I have seen muskie have one of those entirely in its mouth, but sometimes they just get the tail, sometimes they get a portion of it, and that's where I think on those bigger flies, a treble hook just gives you a little bit more likelihood that that's gonna going to stay connected. If it's on these smaller flies here, I typically on my smaller flies will just have a single hook, because usually they're gonna get the whole thing in their mouth, and gonna probably have less of a problem with, just with staying connected. So, do you have any questions on flies before I move on there?
I got one, Ryan.
Yep.
Okay, you said on the larger flies you're using the treble hooks. So by larger, what are you talking about? Like 12 inches and over, or what? What do you consider larger?
I would say once I probably get to somewhere around that, like 12 to 14 inches, something like that. And they're really not critical. I know tons of guys, like that's a huge debate just amongst musky fly guys of, if it's got a treble hook, it's not a fly anymore. And, I guess whatever. And that however you want to look at that. But I just tend to, some of it too is if I build them on a shank rather than building it on, if I build the fly on the hook, then, obviously I probably won't put treble hooks on there. But the thing I do like about the treble hooks are, I build the fly on a shank, and then if a fish, mashes the hooks down, or the hooks don't, they get dull and I can't sharpen them anymore, I don't necessarily have to throw that fly away. I can just split ring a new hook on there. So I do have some smaller flies that, like actually this white one with the little lemon tail on that, that's actually a treble hook fly too. So I honestly, nowadays I do more flies on treble hooks than I do on single hooks, just so mainly so I can keep them lasting longer.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
We got another question from Steven.
Sure.
He's asking you, how do you attach the trebles? Just a split ring off of the shank?
Yeah. So, yep, split rings off the shank. I will sometimes drop a loop in the middle of the shank, which I can probably show you that real quick. Here's I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but here's a fly, and in the middle, there's a loop in the shank there that I attach that treble hook.
Ryan, if you're using your camera,
yep,
your camera's off right now.
Oh, gotcha. Let's see here. I'm not sure how to.
There should be a little camera icon in the top right corner. There you go. Oh.
Leading.
Oh, is it that one? Oh, here we go. Let me know if this works.
Saw you there for a second.
Can you see it now?
I can see you.
Oh, you can? All right.
Upper right.
All right.
I can see it.
Okay. So yeah, so there's right in the middle here, there's a little loop built into the shank. Maybe something to check out if you go on YouTube. There's a YouTube channel called Living the Dream Guide Service. It's from a guide named Luke Swanson up in Minnesota, and he ties a fly called the pig sticker, and he's got some videos about how he ties that, and he shows how he builds those shanks so that you can bend your own metal shanks, kind of like what you'd do for building like bucktail lures, and you can put your own loops in it. And that's kind of one of the nice things about building on shanks too, is you're not limited to the size of the hook. You can, in fact, this fly here is built on a shank that's 8 inches long. So, all right. Am I back on the PowerPoint presentation? Can you guys see that still?
I cannot.
Okay.
No.
All right. Is that right? Yeah. All right.
Hey, Ryan.
Yep.
Hey, what was that guy's name again? The Living the Dream. Can you repeat his name again?
Yeah. Living the Dream Guide Service. Luke Swanson.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. What about now? Can you guys see the presentation?
No.
Are you on the share content icon?
Yes. Let's see.
You go down to that. You can go to window, and it should have whatever apps you have open, and then you can go to your PowerPoint from there.
Did you? Yeah. There you go. All right. Did that do it?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So yeah, get creative with your flies. Don't get too stuck into thinking you got to have a certain fly. Remember, like, it's really all about you. I guess to use a analogy, it's not the arrow, it's the archer, I guess.
And Ryan, one more question before you move on. This one's
Sure.
for me. I know fishing saltwater, those flies get tore up pretty good, especially with bluefish, things like that. I'm assuming same thing happens with muskie. How often or how many fish are these flies going to go through, in your opinion?
Honestly, I can only think of a few flies that I've had to retire just from fish, and typically it's feathers that are the weakest link in that. So you'll notice, like the flies in this photo, I use a lot of synthetic materials too. Bucktail is actually pretty durable as well, but I'm using less and less of the really long tail feathers just because I think those do kind of break off and get bit off. But like those flies in the front, I guess the kind of the 5 in the front, those are all built off of actually just not even material from a fly shop. It's wig hair that I ordered online and build them into a dubbing brush, and that stuff lasts a really long time. And honestly, I can't think of the last one I've had to throw away. So
there you go. Good deal.
Yep. All right. So we'll go to the next one here. Other equipment. I'm going to go quick on this because Tim covered this really well. Definitely have that large landing net. It's critical. Have 2 pairs of pliers at least. I carry a long-handled pair of pliers and a short pair. I will echo sentiment on the wire cutters, and I would just put a little exclamation on the sharp part, because sometimes you're not only cutting lures out of the fish. Sometimes you got to cut a hook out of you, and if it's sharp, it's nice. It goes a lot easier than if it's jumping around and you gotta, if it's just you in the boat and you're cutting a hook out of yourself. Having a nice sharp pair of pliers is worth its weight. So jaw spreaders, we talked about that. Puncture resistant gloves, just helpful when you're messing with the fish, even if you're getting down by its mouth or whatever. Just a little extra protection. I'd also add a first aid kit in case you get nicked. It's being able just to clean a cut. Muskie probably have some pretty funky bacteria in their mouth, so if you're able to add a little like iodine or whatever to it on the water, it's probably going to heal a little faster. Another critical piece is a hook file, especially with flies. It's a little different than with a bait caster rod where you got a lot of power and the rod. That fly rod is going to be pretty soft. It's going to be a lot more bendable, so it's harder to translate all that force into setting a hook, and especially if you're using treble hooks. You're not trying to punch one hook point in, you're trying to push in 3. So you need a lot of force to drive those hooks in, and if your hooks aren't sharp, it's even that much harder. So when Tim said that they fish throw flies, typically they're not throwing the fly because of the leverage, they're throwing the fly because you didn't get a good hook set in it and it didn't push in that barb. So I keep that hook file right in my pocket, and I'm sharpening that every time I switch a fly out. I check all the points. If I get stuck on a tree or a rock, file those points back down. Can't stress that enough. If you're grinding all day long to get 1 or 2 bites and that fish doesn't stay connected, the first thing to check is your fly or your hook points. Have your extra leaders, bite material, snaps, all that, anything you're going to need on the day, have that. And then also one little piece I like, especially for fly fishing, is to carry a towel. It's obviously good for drying your hands off and all that, but inevitably you're going to find snags in your boat that's catching fly line. That towel is what I throw over anything in the boat that's driving me nuts that keeps catching line. So if it's, you know, the motor or handles of bait casting rods or my other flies, I throw that towel over it and that covers it up. It's just, you know, one less thing you got to deal with. Casting. So everybody's heard the fish 10,000 casts. I like to think of it, especially with fly fishing, I don't want to do 10,000 casts, so I'm going to think of it as a fish of 1,000 well-placed casts. That's more challenging with the fly rod, so you know, that's one of the disadvantages of fly fishing, is that it's harder to cover water, it's harder to make that good cast. So really focus on your casts. You know, having the ability to cast a sinking line relatively accurately to 50 feet is important. It's not necessarily critical. We don't always cast that far in the French Broad River, but in other rivers you will. And I always tell people, if they're going to come on a guide trip, if they can practice casting sinking lines before they get in the boat, that's huge, because it's not the same cast as you would throw for a floating line. So just really practice your casting, or just get out and, you know, do some casting whenever you get a chance. And it's probably the most challenging part of fly fishing, is just casting all day long and casting accurately and you know, making a good retrieve. You know, line management, same thing. That's where that towel comes in. Make sure you have a clear area for your fly line, not getting snagged on things. There's nothing worse than making, you know, aiming for the perfect target and landing 10 feet short, only to look down and find 10 feet underneath your feet. That happens probably every 3 or 4 casts for me personally. And if I can eliminate that, you know, if I can be conscious of that before I cast, clear my line, make sure it's all good, make the cast, that's gonna result in just more success. And I can't stress that enough. Is same thing. Expect to struggle with fly fishing. You know, musky fishing is challenging, fly fishing is challenging. You add the two together, you got a good challenge in front of you. So, you know, expect to struggle, embrace it. You know, try to avoid getting frustrated. If you get frustrated, take a break, try to reset your mind, do whatever you got to do. Because if you're not into it, if you're just going through the motions, I can almost promise you, you're not going to catch a fish. And if you do hook into a fish, you're probably not going to be ready for it. So, you know, embrace the struggle and go back to having fun. So that's pretty critical. Same thing, casting efficiency. That's, you know, the more good casts you make, and the more time that flies in the water, the better. Pretty simple when you start boiling it down to, you know, to the basics. Is keeping the fly in the water, making good casts. That's probably the number one thing you can do. I won't get into this whole debate about water loading versus double hauling, but I'll just tell you, water loading is better than double hauling. If you're a saltwater fisherman, you know what double hauling is. Like, it's a great cast. It's a good way to make nice long casts, but it will tear you up if you're fishing. You're throwing these big flies that many times. So get on YouTube. Same Living the Dream Guide Service. He's got a great video on water loading and water hauling. I would get really familiar with that. It just takes so much strain off your body, and just really critical. Presentation. I'll go through this pretty quickly, but, you know, next to casting it, how you bring it back to the boat is probably the number one thing that's going to, you know, get you connected to a fish. And the first part of that is, you know, when you make that cast, let the fly line sink to the desired depth that you want to get. You know, you've probably chosen the right fly line. So, you know, if you got a deep hole and, you know, your fly line sinks 5 inches per second, you want to get it down several feet, you know, you may have to cast, wait a couple seconds, and then start your retrieve. You'll see here, she, in this photo here, she's got her rod tip down in the water. It's pointed at her fly. You always want to make sure when you're retrieving that you got your rod tip pointed at the fly. That's going to make it to where when a fish eats it, you you can strip set immediately. And if you need to, you know, which it's kind of the last thing you would ever want to do, but if you needed to sweep the rod to kind of catch up to the fish, you could do that. If you got the rod off to the side as you're retrieving it, as soon as that fish hits, the thing that's going to happen is your rod's going to bend and you're going to get no set. You're not going to get a firm strip set on the fish. So always point the rod at the fly. You want a straight line so that as soon as you pull on the line, nothing's bending. You just got straight line right to the fish. So you can put, you know, as much force as you can put into setting those hooks. Also, just like with gear fishing, you know, like we think about all those different type of lures that are out there. We want to, I think the best way to get a fish's attention is to make big movements with the fly. So I like to think of those as macro movements. Big side to side movements is going to catch their attention. Muskies know what's in their strike zone, what's in their area. They may not move on it, but if you're moving that fly, you know, big movements, that, in my opinion, is what gets their attention. The other half of that is when you make those big movements, you still have to trigger that fish to eat. And that's when I find the pauses are the thing that will make the fish eat. And this is by no means all the time. This is just my kind of default approach, is big movements to catch their attention, pauses, and little subtle movements within those pauses that can trigger the fish to give them the opportunity to strike. So you don't want to be moving that fish so much that it just never sees a window to strike. You want to make those big movements, give it a window to strike with that pause, and then hopefully that's when they eat. Speed and cadence is important, just like with any fishing. If you're having a tough day or you're just not getting any feedback from fish, I vary up all these things that we just talked about. I vary my speed, depth, the movement of the fly. You know, maybe I'm doing full length arm strips of my line every time, making that fly move 3-4 feet. If that's not working, I'm gonna go short little kind of staccato type strips, you know, maybe a foot at a time or 6 inches at a time. I'm varying everything as much as I can until I get a fish to give me some feedback to let me know I'm doing something right. And then you can rinse and repeat. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, you know, your fly is important, but the right presentation is far more important than the right fly. You can make that same fly do the same thing as multiple different flies just by how you retrieve it. And I always tell people when I've got clients on the water, I tell them when they ask what should I do with the fly, I tell them make it do something cool. And then usually there's a pause, and I can tell they're thinking about that. And then inevitably they ask, like, what makes the fly do something cool? And that's when I tell them that's for you to figure out. You know, that's where your creativity comes into it. That's where you being attentive to what that fly is doing, you getting into it. Like sometimes when I can think back on fish I've caught, and I can remember getting nervous before I even saw the fish, just because that fly was looking so good and dancing side to side. I just felt like at any moment it was going to get eaten, and sure enough it does. So the more you can kind of get into that mentality of, you know, imagine like playing with a cat, you know, teasing it. That's what you're doing. You're trying to elicit a strike. So, you know, get into that presentation. No right or wrong way to do it. And, that's a big thing with muskie fishing and fly fishing for me. It's just that creativity. Tim talked a lot about figure eight, so I'll go quick on this. I know I'm going a little long here. You know, do your figure eights every retrieve, or at least a figure J. You know, that's sometimes the first time you'll ever see a fish is on those figure eights. With the fly rod, I try to leave about 12 to 18 inches of my bite tippet and leader out of the tip of the rod. If you go too short on that, you can risk breaking the tip of the fly rod. If you know, if you set into that fish real quick and it shakes its head a few times, it's really easy to break a rod tip. So that's about kind of the sweet spot. If you go too long with it, your turns and your figure eight won't be as wide. You avoid sudden movements, banging the boat. Try not to rock the boat. Try not to do anything that could distract that fish from the figure eight or from your fly. Talked about going deeper with the figure eight on the inside, shallower on the outside. Speed up and slow down just depending on how that fish is reacting. And that's just going to take practice of, more time on the water. You're going to start to learn how the fish is acting and, what you think you should do with your figure eight. If the fish eats at the boat, it's important to keep that rod tip low and sweep the rod to the tail of the fish. So if that fish eats it in the figure eight, you want to keep that rod tip down. And if you can in the moment, remember to bring the rod towards the tail of the fish rather than trying to pull the fly away from the fish. That'll just keep it to where that hook hopefully goes in the corner of the mouth rather than pulling it out of the mouth. When you feel solid resistance on the fish, I would go ahead and set again, because more often than not, you're not going to get a good hook set on that first hook set. Same thing with fighting and land them. Just keep that rod tip low. I always tell people, don't let the rod tip get above your waist. Those fly rods are so soft that if you bring that fly rod up, the only thing you're doing is letting that your rod's just going to act like a shock absorber. That tip is there to protect. The reason the rods bend, at least when we're not talking about the cast, is to just protect like a tippet. So if you're thinking about like trout fishing, the softer your rod tip, that just helps to where when that fish shakes its head, it's not snapping the line. Well, we've got 50-pound strength tippet or leader is our weakest link in the system, so we don't have to worry about that. So we don't want that rod tip bending while we're fighting a fish. We really just want to keep solid pressure to it, trying to get the fish to the net as quickly as possible. If it tries to run on you, I don't let it. If it's running on you, it's gonna run on you, and you don't have to worry about it. But if I'm constantly fighting and trying to bring it closer to the boat, that's my goal. I'm also not trying to fight the fish on the reel. So if I cast 40 feet and I'm stripping to the boat, I probably got 30 feet of fly line at my feet. I don't want to try to reel that 30 feet of fly line at my feet onto the reel and possibly lose the fish, because all I'm doing is just reeling up slack. I'd rather just fight that fish with my left hand and keep tight to it and worry about reeling in my line once I got the fish in the net, if that makes sense. So that's why that reel, that's why I say don't spend your money on an expensive reel, because we're gonna fight that fish manually. Like I said, get the fish to the net as soon as possible, just not too soon. Try to net the fish head first, try to lead it into the net rather than, if your buddy's about to net the fish, just don't have him net the fish, as the fish is swimming away from him. Just try to bring it in and get it in there as quick as you can. Handling and releasing, basically, my preference is, especially if you're wearing waders, or if it's nice time of year and you're able to get out of the water to handle the fish, that just makes it easier to keep the fish in the net. You're in the water with the fish in the net. This makes everything easy. Before you pull the fish out of the water, if you can have your camera and your measuring tools ready, that way that fish is just nice and comfortable in the net, in the water, upright and all that stuff. Then whenever the guy with the camera is ready, just pull the fish quickly out. You got, that fish in this photo was out maybe 5-10 seconds at most, and you can see how clean that fish is, and it swam away just as clean as it came in. So really, try to keep the fish as healthy as possible, and that's what I'd recommend, is if you can get in the water. Plus, I think it just makes for a better photo when you can do it, rather than seeing all the junk in the boat. Also, when you release the fish, if you can keep that fish upright in the net, or when you release it, let it let it recover in slow water. Like you don't want to have your net hanging off the fast side of the boat, the fast current. Also, when you're releasing them, you see guys that'll kind of bring the fish back and forth and like going forward and backwards. And from my understanding, that's really not the best way to revive these guys, or to basically just hold them static in the water in some slow current. They'll recover on their own. And when they start trying to swim away from you, just let them go. Don't make them kick away from you hard or anything like that. Just let them go when they're ready. And then I think this is the last one, hopefully. Tips and tactics for the French Broad. Biggest thing I would say, biggest thing I see people, I don't want to say do wrong, but the biggest tip I would give them is to go slower. Fly fishing is a slower process. For every cast you make with a fly rod, your buddy with conventional tackle could probably make 2 casts. And you're going to make more mistakes casting. So if you slow your boat down as you're going down the river, you're just going to be able to fish at your own pace. So slow your drift, especially when the water's moving faster. Focus on that slower, deeper water. There's lots of it on the French Broad, so focus on the slower, deeper stuff you can find, and then pick that stuff apart. So if you see log jams, sandbars, cut banks, all that stuff, especially when fishing slow, if you can pick that structure, the best looking structure you can find, if you can pick that apart, drop your anchor and pick it apart, that's always a good tip. Also, somebody mentioned it earlier with the lures and your angle retrieve. I think that's absolutely huge with flies because they're affected even more by the current. So there's no one tip I can give you for that, but other than just to pay attention to how that current affects the movement of your flies. I will say, for one thing I do a lot of times, if I'm drifting in my boat, obviously I'm drifting downstream, I'm often casting my fly back upstream into those eddies and pulling them kind of with the current, which just with any, glide baits and flies both, the only way you get that side to side action is to impart some slack into the line. So if you're casting downstream into the current, you just can't get any slack into the line. So that fly is just going to kind of be static. But if I can cast upstream and the current's kind of pulling my fly downstream with me, there's more slack in the line so that when I do that next strip, it's darting all over the place. So pay attention to that. You use your stealth and finesse to your advantage. You got that with fly fishing. When it's low and clear like it is right now, fly is a great option. So, use that stealth to your advantage. I've said it a bunch, get creative, be creative, experiment with your own ideas. Nobody's got it all figured out. So, come up with your own bag of tricks and just avoid the monotony and boredom. When things get repetitive and you're bored, that's when you're least effective. So fish hard, fish often, get out there as much as you can, different weather patterns, different times of the year. The more you're on the water, there's no replacement to time on the water. And then most importantly, have fun. So I think that's it. I've got my email address there. If anybody has any questions about anything, just shoot me an email. Happy to answer questions. If anybody wants to do a float trip sometime for musky smallmouth bass, you can hit up my email, or you can check out our website at AshevilleFlyFishingCompany.com.